I'm just going to plot time, and that's the history of the Earth, the history of the solar system, the history of the universe, a few thousand years. And I did not label the vertical axis. In fact, I would like that to represent a number of things, because there's an interesting trend in nature. What we are finding is that at one or more points in history, there was an acceleration, a speed up of many distinct events. Let me mention some examples. The Genesis flood. I want to apply that to the peak that you see on this red curve. During that year-long flood, there was rapid formation of sedimentary strata and rapid formation of fossils. It was a unique event in physical history. So there, things may be changing kind of uniform today, but we had that singularity in history, the flood event. Let me add another one to this curve. There's been a group of creationists working for the last 7 or 8 years on something that's called the RATE project. This group has been exploring radioisotope dating. Why is it that we come up often with multi-million or billion years for the ages of rocks, including moon rocks? What this group is concluding, and they have evidence to back it up, is that at some point in past history, radioisotopes speeded up in their decay. Half-lives were shortened. And so you can't date rocks today and trust the answers because all the clocks have been reset. There was a point in history when radioactive decay was accelerated. And I'm letting that represent itself by that peak in that curve. Because of that, we feel that typical radioisotope dating has been invalidated. These two objects that I'm listing here could be plotted on the vertical axis of this graph. But let me add a couple of more. Now, we haven't said much about Mars. That's another interesting planet. It has craters on it, it has ravines and canyons, and it doesn't seem to be changing today. And the current view is that at some point in history, Mars experienced a short, intense period of geologic activity. It's represented by the peak in that curve. Something happened on Mars, even though it has settled down today. Now let me come back to our current topic, the moon. Remember all these craters we have? Millions of craters? Maybe on occasion they're forming today, but a lot of them did form in the past. And the thought is that many of these moon craters we look at form very quickly during one unique event in history. I believe that all of these major events that I've listed, and many more could be added to this list, these discontinuities in our current nature, I believe these all coincide at the same time in history. And the likely candidate for all of these events is the Genesis flood story. Now, I must say, I've always hesitated to say that the flood was accompanied by cosmic events on the moon and on Mars and in space. But the evidence does point to a large number of variables which experienced a temporary surge, and I believe this is most likely at the time of the flood. This needs to be worked out with creation details, why the flood event hammered the whole solar system with craters, but it's an interesting area of research that is being addressed today. Now we come to the design of the moon. I really enjoy this part of creation. Something like the moon is not there by chance or accident. It's not a random event, but instead there are reasons for the moon. God had purposes. He had plans for everything that He put in space. So let me ask you, what's the moon up there for? Does it do anything for you? Would you miss the moon if it was gone? I started a list. I got to thinking about this, why the moon is in the sky. And it turns out that this list goes on, and I'm sure it could be extended. But here's just a few purposes for this created moon that we enjoy. Now, some of the reasons are quite obvious. The moon is a night light. Remember the lesser light that rules the night? And of course, that's been precious through history. And maybe we've got street lights around our campus here, but for many people on the earth, that reflected sunlight on the moon is still very important. And of course, as we are finding out, moonlight is very critical to agriculture and to the biorhythms of plants and animals and people. Next on our list, and let me put these together, the C words. The moon functions as a clock. Once you get familiar with moon phases, you can tell time by it. The moon is a calendar. You can tell seasons by the moon. The moon is a compass. You can tell directions. All practical reasons, I believe, why our Creator put the moon in the sky. Those three ideas, starting with a C, just remind us of how regular the moon is. It's so dependable, following the laws that were established back there during the creation week. This involves things like eclipses. We know exactly when the next eclipse is coming along. You can look forward to it, and it happens right on schedule because of these faithful, unchanging laws that govern our whole universe. In fact, while I'm talking about eclipses, let me just give you a little a report for the future, something to look forward to. Now, some of you have seen a solar eclipse before, and I'm not talking about a partial eclipse that occurs every year or so, but a total eclipse of the sun, when it gets dark during the daytime for several minutes and the birds get confused. Those are very unusual. Well, there's an eclipse of the sun predicted and scheduled for the year 2017. So we need to hang on for that, because if you see the line across this map, it'll be going right through this area. In fact, it cuts right across the whole country, and this hasn't happened for a long time. This might be a good future investment in telescopes. This is going to really capture the country's attention as this approaches. And by the way, 7 years after that, there's going to be another total eclipse, quite similar, right across the middle of the country. How do we know this so exactly? Because eclipses are like the compass, the calendar. It follows right on schedule. It's so very dependable. That's the way God made the moon. Now, of course, the other kind of eclipses are lunar eclipses, and they make beautiful pictures. These are less rare. This happens every year or so when the moon moves through the Earth's shadow. This is just kind of an overlap picture here. When the moon turns that brownish red color, something else just to look forward to. Now, some of the other purposes of the moon are not quite as obvious as a night light or a compass or a calendar. This is an interesting picture, by the way. This shows a waxing crescent moon. Can you see the thin moon there? Maybe you've seen that before. It's the greatest time of the month when you have this moon. You know, this kind of moon was very important to Israelites in the Old Testament. Their calendar was based on the moon. And they would call this a new moon when they could see this thin sliver. And they had watchers on the wall. When they observed this moon, that began their new month. It's always been a calendar, a way to keep track of things in past history. Now, some of these other purposes. The idea of stable seasons. Did you know that the moon is responsible for our seasons? And this is something that's been studied by computers really just in the last 15 years. Now, the Earth circles the sun once a year. And the Earth has a tilt of its axis of about 23.5 degrees, and it maintains that. And so as the year goes by, the sun appears to move above the equator. That's our summertime. And then it moves below the equator, and that becomes summertime down under. And so the seasons go. Computer studies show that it's the moon that stabilizes the tilt of the Earth. With no moon, the Earth's axis would swing erratically between 0 degrees and 90 degrees. We wouldn't know what was coming next. We might go from summer to a hotter summer. Our seasons would be unpredictable and certainly more severe. In fact, you can tie this in with Scripture. Psalm 104:19 declares that the moon marks off the seasons. It does, and it even helps control the seasons. I'm going through this list of purposes, and we're already down to the bottom of the list. Let me put these two together. This is, along with the moonlight, the one that we are most familiar with, the moon's tides. So just have some water to go with this. There is evidence that the lunar tides dominate the currents of the oceans. Now, these tides result from the moon's gravity pulling on the earth. These tide forces amount to an amazing amount. In fact, the number is 2,000 trillion tons of force. No wonder the oceans move with that kind of gravity pull from our nearest neighbor, the moon. In fact, the power generated by the tides equals that of all the power plants of the earth combined together. This constant motion of the ocean waters keeps the seas alive. If there was no moon, the oceans would soon become stagnant and unhealthy. The marine life, both the plants and the animals, would perish. The seashore would no longer be inviting. Now, there are vast amounts of floating plants in the ocean. We call them the plankton, the grasses of the sea. And there are also larger sea plants. It is estimated that 30 to 50% of our planet's supply of oxygen is provided by this sea vegetation. After all, the oceans do cover 3/4 of the earth. Without the moon, there would be no tides. There would be no marine plants. We would not have sufficient oxygen to breathe. Our very breath is dependent on the existence of the moon. It keeps the oceans healthy. We've looked at the moon's origin, and we find that supernatural creation makes good sense. No natural origin theory is convincing or adequate or comparable to the majesty of creation. Next, we consider the age of the moon. Lunar recession, crater Bruno, and the many other craters which happen quickly, I believe, point to a youthful moon. And then we summarize several purposes of the moon. And what we find is that even in an imperfect world, the blessings provided by the moon are obvious and they're amazing. The moon is placed in the sky for our well-being. The moon is not only our nearest neighbor in space, it's a clear, beautiful, silent witness for the creation. Thank you.